October 1907, New York City. On a cold morning in Manhattan, something unusual was happening outside the banks of Wall Street. Men stood in long lines along the sidewalks, some holding newspapers, others speaking quietly with the people beside them, but most of them simply waited. They were waiting to withdraw their money. Inside the financial district, rumors had begun spreading the night before. A large trust company was in trouble. Depositors had started removing their savings, and cash was leaving the banks faster than it could be replaced. At first, most people believed the situation would calm down quickly. Financial panics had visited Wall Street before, and they had always passed. But as the morning continued, the lines outside the banks began to grow longer. Clerks inside the buildings counted money as quickly as they could, while messengers rushed between offices carrying instructions from anxious investors. Something was changing. Confidence was beginning to disappear. My name is James R. Keene, and I had spent many years watching markets behave in ways that surprised even the most experienced traders. I had seen speculation turn into panic more than once. But on that October morning in 1907, the atmosphere in New York felt different. The city was nervous, and when New York becomes nervous, the entire financial world begins to listen. At first, the market tried to ignore the problem. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, traders continued shouting orders as they always had, while prices moved up and down in the usual rhythm of speculation. But beneath the noise of trading, something far more dangerous was beginning to grow. Fear. The trouble that week had not begun with the banks. It had begun with speculation. Only days earlier, a group of traders had attempted to control the stock of a company called United Copper. Their plan was simple. If they could buy enough shares, they could force traders who had sold the stock short to buy it back at higher prices. The strategy was well known on Wall Street. Sometimes it produced enormous profits, but sometimes it ended in disaster. This time it ended in disaster. Instead of rising, the price of United Copper collapsed. The traders who had attempted to control the stock lost enormous sums of money, and banks and trust companies that had financed the speculation suddenly faced serious losses. Rumors began moving through the financial district as investors tried to understand which institutions had been involved and which banks might now be exposed to the failed speculation. No one knew the full answer, and uncertainty is often more dangerous than bad news because uncertainty allows fear to grow. Within hours, depositors began withdrawing their money from several trust companies across the city. At first, the withdrawals were small, but they quickly grew larger. By the next morning, the lines outside the banks had become impossible to ignore. One institution in particular stood at the center of the growing crisis: the Knickerbocker Trust Company. It was one of the largest trust companies in New York, and thousands of investors trusted the institution with their savings. But when rumors connected the company to the failed United Copper speculation, depositors began to worry. And worried depositors rarely wait long. They withdraw their money. Soon the line outside the Knickerbocker building stretched down the street. Men removed their hats as they waited in the cold, while clerks moved quickly behind the counters inside the building, counting stacks of cash and handing them to nervous customers. But no bank keeps enough cash to satisfy every depositor at the same time. Banks depend on trust, and when that trust disappears, even strong institutions can collapse. By the afternoon, the situation had become impossible to control. The Knickerbocker Trust Company closed its doors, and the moment the news spread across Wall Street, the panic truly began. Stocks fell sharply, banks stopped lending, credit disappeared from the financial system. Inside the New York Stock Exchange, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Orders to sell began appearing faster than buyers could absorb them, while brokers shouted prices across the trading floor and clerks struggled to record the constant changes. The decline was accelerating. From where I watched the chaos unfolding, one fact was already clear. This was no longer simply a falling market. It was the beginning of a financial panic. The closing of the Knickerbocker Trust Company sent a shock through the entire financial district. Within hours, the news had spread across New York, and depositors rushed toward other trust companies. afraid that their savings might disappear if they waited too long. Lines began forming outside banks across the city, some stretching around entire blocks. Inside the institutions, clerks counted money as quickly as they could, but the pressure continued to grow. Every withdrawal created another rumor, and every rumor created another withdrawal. The financial system of New York depended on confidence. Banks did not keep enough cash to satisfy every depositor at once. They relied on the simple belief that most people would leave their money where it was. But in October of 1907, that belief was beginning to disappear. By the next morning, the panic had spread beyond the trust companies. Banks grew cautious, and loans that had once been easy to obtain suddenly became difficult. Brokers who depended on borrowed money to finance their trades discovered that credit was disappearing. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the effects were immediate. Stocks began falling faster as orders to sell flooded the market, while traders attempted to escape their positions before prices dropped even further. The noise on the trading floor grew louder with every passing hour as brokers shouted desperate orders and messengers rushed between trading posts carrying instructions from frightened investors across the country. But selling was easy, buying was not. Buyers were becoming scarce because many investors believed the situation might grow worse before it improved, and when men expect prices to fall, they rarely rush to buy. The decline accelerated. Prices slipped lower and lower throughout the day, while companies that had been considered safe investments only weeks earlier suddenly traded at levels that shocked even experienced traders. The problem was not simply falling prices, it was the disappearance of credit. Wall Street runs on borrowed money. Traders borrow funds from banks to finance their positions, and businesses borrow capital to expand their operations. When banks stop lending, the entire system begins to freeze. That was exactly what was happening. Brokers who normally had access to enormous sums of money suddenly found themselves unable to borrow even small amounts. Without credit, they were forced to sell their holdings, and forced selling pushes markets lower. From where I stood observing the floor, the pattern was painfully familiar. Markets do not collapse because prices fall, they collapse because trust disappears. And trust was disappearing quickly. By the next day, the situation had grown even more dangerous. The panic that had begun with the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust Company was now spreading through the entire financial system. Depositors continued withdrawing their money from banks and trust companies across New York, while crowds gathered outside financial institutions throughout the city, waiting for hours to withdraw their savings. Banks began protecting their reserves. Instead of lending money to brokers and businesses as they normally would, they held their cash tightly. Credit continued disappearing from the system, and without credit, Wall Street could not function. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, stocks continued falling, while the price board changed constantly as selling orders arrived faster than buyers could absorb them. Traders who depended on borrowed money found themselves trapped. Without credit, they were forced to liquidate their positions. Some sold calmly, others sold desperately. Each new wave of selling pushed the market lower. Panic was beginning to take control of the market. From where I stood, watching the chaos unfold, the pattern was becoming clear. This was no longer a normal decline. This was a financial crisis. That evening, the most powerful men on Wall Street gathered inside the private library of J.P. Morgan. Morgan listened carefully as bankers described the pressure their institutions were facing. Depositors were withdrawing money. Credit was disappearing. Trust companies were close to collapse. Morgan understood that restoring confidence would require more than promises. It would require money, large amounts of it. According to several accounts of that night, he made a dramatic decision. The doors of the library were locked. The bankers inside would not leave until they reached an agreement. For hours, the discussions continued until one by one the bankers agreed to provide support. Millions of dollars were pledged to stabilize the banks and trust companies under pressure. The plan was simple: restore confidence, because confidence was the only force powerful enough to stop the panic. The following morning, Wall Street waited nervously to see what would happen. Rumors had circulated throughout the night, but when the New York Stock Exchange opened, something unexpected began to happen. The selling slowed. At first, the change was subtle, but the violent waves of selling that had shaken the market the day before were beginning to disappear. Money had returned to the system as emergency funds began flowing through the financial district. Confidence slowly began returning. Buyers appeared again, not many at first, but enough. Stocks began stabilizing as traders realized that the panic might not destroy the market after all. From where I stood observing the market, the lesson was already clear. Markets are not destroyed by falling prices alone. They are destroyed when confidence disappears completely. In October of 1907, confidence had come dangerously close to vanishing. But at the last moment, leadership and cooperation had stopped the panic from consuming the entire system. In the years that followed, discussions began about creating a central banking system capable of stabilizing financial markets during moments of crisis. Those discussions eventually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. But on that October night in 1907, the future of the market depended on something far simpler. Trust. Trust between banks. Trust between investors. And trust that the financial system itself would survive the panic. My name is James R. Keene, and the events of that week reminded every trader on Wall Street of a lesson markets repeat again and again. Confidence builds markets, but fear can destroy them overnight.